Welcome back to Crime and Prison. Let's take a deep dive into this bizarre true crime story that is so unusual and unexpected that it seems unbelievable. Patty Hearst's story is one of the most bizarre and controversial episodes in American history, a tale of wealth, privilege, radicalism, and questions of free will. In 1974, she was a wealthy college student who was kidnapped by a radical group. But then, something even more shocking happened. She seemed to join the radical group, taking part in crimes that stunned the nation. Was she forced, or did she choose this path? Was she a victim, brainwashed by a dangerous cult, or did she willingly choose a life of rebellion? How then did a kidnapping turn into a nationwide spectacle and a love story became a cautionary tale? In this video, we'll explore the incredible true story of Patty Hearst, from her kidnapping to the mystery of what really happened. Let's dive into this stranger-than-life story. Patricia Hearst, who preferred to be called Patricia instead of Patty, was born on February 20, 1954, in San Francisco, California. She is the third of 5 daughters of Randolph Apperson Hearst and Catherine Wood Campbell. Patricia grew up mainly in Hillsborough and attended several private schools, including Crystal Springs School for Girls, Sacred Heart in Atherton, and Santa Catalina School in Monterey. She later studied at Menlo College in Atherton before transferring to the University of California, Berkeley. Patricia Hearst's grandfather, William Randolph Hearst, was a legendary American media tycoon who built an enormous empire in the fields of newspapers, magazines, newsreels, and films. Born in 1863, William Randolph Hearst inherited significant wealth from his father, a successful miner, but he dramatically expanded his fortune and influence by transforming the American media landscape. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Hearst acquired numerous newspapers across the United States, including major publications like the San Francisco Examiner and the New York Journal, which became known for their sensational reporting style, often called yellow journalism. His approach to journalism emphasized eye-catching headlines, bold illustrations, and emotional stories, which significantly increased newspaper sales and shaped the public's perception of news. Beyond newspapers, Hearst extended his influence into magazines. He founded and acquired several popular titles, such as Good Housekeeping, Cosmopolitan, and Harper's Bazaar, making his publishing empire a dominant force in American culture. These magazines appealed to a wide audience, from middle-class families to fashion enthusiasts, allowing Hearst to shape social trends and public opinion. William Randolph Hearst also ventured into the world of newsreels and films, becoming a pioneer in merging print and visual media. His company produced newsreels, short documentary-style films shown in theaters before movies, giving audiences visual access to current events. This combination of print and film media amplified his influence, making Hearst a household name and a significant figure in the entertainment industry. At its peak, Hearst's empire included 28 newspapers, 18 magazines, several radio stations, and film production companies, making him one of the most powerful and influential figures in American media. His massive estate, Hearst Castle in San Simeon, California, became a symbol of his wealth and power, attracting Hollywood stars, politicians, and other influential figures of the time. Despite his media success, William Randolph Hearst's influence was not without controversy. His newspapers were often criticized for their sensationalism and sometimes misleading stories. Nonetheless, his legacy in the world of media is undeniable, as he set the foundations for modern journalism and mass communication. His granddaughter, Patricia Hearst, grew up in the shadow of this vast media empire, which played a significant role in the public's fascination with her kidnapping by the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, in 1974. Patty's great-grandmother, Phoebe Hearst, on the other hand was also a well-known philanthropist. Patricia Hearst's great-grandmother, Phoebe Apperson Hearst, was a prominent American philanthropist, activist, and supporter of education and women's rights in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Born in 1842 in Missouri, Phoebe Hearst married George Hearst, a wealthy miner and businessman who later became a U.S. Senator. With her husband's growing fortune, Phoebe became one of the wealthiest women in America, and she used her resources to fund a wide range of charitable and educational causes. Phoebe Hearst is perhaps best known for her contributions to education, particularly for women and young children. She was a significant benefactor of the University of California, Berkeley, where she funded scholarships, buildings, and various educational initiatives. In 1891, she became the first female regent of the University of California, making her a pioneering figure in higher education governance at a time when women had limited roles in academia. Her contributions helped shape the university into a major educational institution, with programs and facilities that have had a lasting impact. Beyond Berkeley, Phoebe was deeply involved in promoting education for young children. She was one of the founders of the National Congress of Mothers, which later became the Parent-Teacher Association, PTA. This organization was dedicated to improving children's welfare and creating better educational environments in schools, influencing early childhood education practices across the United States. She also supported the establishment of kindergartens, believing in the importance of early childhood education for children's development. Phoebe Hearst's philanthropy extended to libraries and museums. She played a key role in funding the construction of libraries in underserved communities, contributing to the establishment of the Hearst Free Library in Anaconda, Montana, among others. Her dedication to arts and culture led her to fund archaeological expeditions and donate collections of artifacts, some of which became part of the permanent collection at museums such as the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. This museum, named in her honor, is one of the oldest anthropology museums in the United States, showcasing her commitment to preserving and sharing knowledge about diverse cultures. A strong supporter of women's rights, Phoebe Hearst was involved in the women's suffrage movement, advocating for women's right to vote. She believed in empowering women through education and social reforms, and her financial support was crucial to various women's organizations that fought for equal rights. Phoebe Hearst's impact as a philanthropist was felt nationwide, as she gave generously to hospitals, schools, and cultural institutions. Her legacy of generosity and dedication to social causes influenced her descendants, including her granddaughter Patricia Hearst, who grew up in a family with a history of significant wealth and public influence. Phoebe's efforts in education and women's rights left a lasting mark on American society, and she remains remembered as one of the leading philanthropists of her era. The Hearst family had significant political influence and had opposed organized labor, gold miners' rights, and communism since before World War II. Patricia's father was one of several heirs to the family fortune, but he did not control the Hearst businesses. Patricia Hearst's parents, Randolph Apperson Hearst and Catherine Wood Campbell, did not believe it was necessary to take additional security precautions to protect their children, despite the family's immense wealth and public prominence. The Hearst family, being part of one of the wealthiest and most well-known dynasties in America, lived with a sense of privilege and assumed safety, leading them to maintain a relatively open and unguarded lifestyle. Randolph Hearst was married to Catherine Wood Campbell, originally from Atlanta, Georgia. Together, they had 5 daughters, Catherine, Virginia, Patricia, commonly known as Patty, Anne, and Victoria. Catherine Hearst was a devout Roman Catholic, a faith that played a significant role in her life and values. Her conservative views extended into her public and civic engagements, particularly in education. Catherine served as a regent for the University of California, a position she held with a strong sense of duty and commitment to traditional values. Her tenure, however, came to an end in 1976 when she chose to resign. This decision was notably influenced by the intense public scrutiny and media attention surrounding the kidnapping of her daughter, Patricia, Patty Hearst, by the Symbionese Liberation Army in 1974. The event became a sensational and high-profile case that affected the entire Hearst family, bringing them into the national spotlight. Despite the controversies and challenges, Catherine Hearst remained a steadfast and influential figure, respected for her advocacy and contributions, particularly in the realms of education and faith-based initiatives. She continued to support conservative causes and maintained a strong presence in her social and community circles, embodying a blend of traditional values and resilience amidst a turbulent period in her family's life. The Hearsts were part of a high-profile family, with ties to influential media and business circles, yet they chose to raise their 5 daughters, including Patricia, in an environment that was not heavily shielded by security measures. Unlike some wealthy families who employed bodyguards, security systems, and other protective services, the Hearsts' approach was more relaxed. They did not see a need to impose strict security protocols or hire private security details, perhaps due to a belief that they were not at risk or that additional precautions would be unnecessary or intrusive. This lack of heightened security may have been influenced by the social climate of the time. In the early 1970s, while there were instances of political unrest and protests, it was still relatively uncommon for families of the elite to face direct threats or acts of violence. Thus, Randolph and Catherine Hearst might have felt that enhanced security was an overreaction, and they wanted their children to have a relatively normal upbringing despite their privileged status. However, this sense of safety was shattered on February 4, 1974, when Patricia Hearst, then a 19-year-old college student, was violently abducted from her apartment in Berkeley, California, by the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA. The kidnapping exposed the vulnerabilities of the family's unguarded lifestyle, and the shock of Patricia's abduction made it clear that their assumptions about security had been dangerously naive. The absence of preventive measures and security planning highlighted the reality that being part of a wealthy and influential family did not make them immune to the dangers of a society facing social and political upheaval. In the aftermath of the kidnapping, Patricia's parents were criticized for not taking greater precautions to protect her, particularly given the public profile of the Hearst family. The situation underscored the unexpected risks that could arise for those in the public eye and became a lesson in the need for security awareness, even among families who feel insulated by wealth and influence. The ordeal led to a significant change in how high-profile families approached safety, as the kidnapping served as a stark reminder that even the wealthy and privileged were not exempt from the risks of targeted violence. At the time of her kidnapping, Patricia was a sophomore at Berkeley, studying art history, and living in an apartment with her fiancé, Stephen Weed. On February 4, 1974, 19-year-old Patricia Hearst was kidnapped from her apartment in Berkeley. A small, radical left-wing group called the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, took responsibility for the abduction. The kidnapping was partly a matter of opportunity, since Hearst lived close to the SLA's hideout. The Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, also known as the United Federated Forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army, was a small, radical far-left group in the United States that operated between 1973 and 1975. The group saw itself as a revolutionary movement, aiming to bring about social change through militant actions, and claimed to be a vanguard fighting for the oppressed. DeFries became involved with the SLA after being recruited while in prison, where he had been serving time for various crimes. Upon his release, he adopted the name Cinque Mtum, a nod to his desire for self-reinvention and his identification with African revolutionary movements. He later became known as General Field Marshal Cinque, a title that reflected his leadership role within the SLA. Under his command, the group sought to initiate an armed revolution in the U.S., aiming to overthrow the capitalist system and confront what they saw as systemic oppression, particularly against African Americans and marginalized communities. Donald DeFries was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio. He had a difficult childhood. He dropped out of high school and began committing crimes at a young age, with his criminal record starting when he was only 14. In the late 1960s, he was placed on probation, which led some to believe he may have been acting as an informant for the Los Angeles Police Department. However, this theory remains controversial and has never been definitively proven. DeFries became more radicalized in 1970. He started planning violent actions with a group with the mindset that bold and aggressive moves could ignite a larger movement within the African American community. They aimed to raise awareness about systemic racism and injustice, hoping their actions would inspire others to join their cause and lead to a wider revolt against what they viewed as an oppressive system. One of the most infamous actions led by the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, of which DeFreeze was the leader, was the assassination of Marcus Foster, the superintendent of public schools in Oakland, California. In November 1973, 3 members of the SLA ambushed Foster, who had recently become the first African-American superintendent of a major public school system in the U.S. The radical group thought Foster supported a controversial program to introduce student identification cards in Oakland schools, which they saw as a form of control and surveillance over students, particularly those in the black community. They didn't know Foster was against it. However, the radical group's misunderstanding led to Foster's tragic demise. During the attack, Foster was fatally shot, and his deputy was wounded. The murder of Marcus Foster was widely condemned, even by some of the radical left-wing groups of the time, who viewed the attack as a reckless and unjustified use of violence. In January 1974, 2 SLA members, Russ Little and Joe Ramiro, were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to prison for their roles in Foster's assassination. This event marked the beginning of the SLA's violent campaign and brought them to the attention of law enforcement across the nation. After these arrests, the group took more extreme actions, which eventually led to the kidnapping of Patricia Hearst. The radical group saw the kidnapping of Patricia Hearst as a strategic move to gain leverage over authorities. By capturing a member of the wealthy and influential Hearst family, the radical group aimed to exert significant pressure on the government and law enforcement, forcing them to comply with their demands. Their primary goal was to secure the release of 2 of their members, Russ Little and Joe Ramiro, who had been arrested and imprisoned for the murder of Marcus Foster, the superintendent of Oakland Public Schools. The radical group believed that by taking someone as high-profile as Patricia Hearst, they would generate massive media coverage, which they could then use to amplify their political message and draw attention to their cause. Patricia's status as the granddaughter of media mogul William Randolph Hearst made her a valuable hostage in their eyes. They were confident that the Hearst family's wealth, connections, and influence would force authorities to listen to their demands, particularly since the Hearsts were known for their prominence in American society and politics. Shortly after the kidnapping, the SLA released statements and tapes, making it clear that Patricia's life was at risk if their demands were not met. The primary demand was the release of Little and Ramiro, who the radical group viewed as political prisoners, unjustly incarcerated for fighting against systemic oppression. By holding Patricia hostage, the radical group intended to show that they were willing to take extreme actions for what they believed was a just cause, aiming to create a sense of urgency and panic among the Hearst family and law enforcement. As negotiations with authorities dragged on and their initial demand for a prisoner exchange was rejected, the radical group shifted tactics. They issued a series of increasingly complex and difficult conditions, hoping to prolong the crisis and maintain public and media interest. They demanded that Patricia's father, Randolph Hearst, provide millions of dollars worth of food to the poor in California, framing it as a revolutionary act to help the needy and criticize the wealth inequality that they felt the Hearst family represented. The radical group's tactic of using Patricia Hearst's capture as a bargaining tool not only put immense pressure on her family and the authorities but also raised ethical and moral questions in the public sphere. Some saw the group's demands as an expression of legitimate social grievances, while others viewed the abduction as a purely criminal act of terrorism, using violence to further a radical agenda. The strategy ultimately backfired for the radical group. The kidnapping generated widespread media attention, but instead of drawing sympathy to their cause, it highlighted the brutality of their methods. The prolonged negotiations and escalating demands alienated much of the public, turning the radical group into a symbol of extremist violence rather than revolutionary idealism. The use of Patricia as a pawn in a political struggle brought into sharp focus the ethical limits of protest and highlighted the desperate lengths to which the radical group was willing to go to make their message heard. The abduction also placed Patricia Hearst herself in a complex and traumatic situation, with far-reaching consequences. Her captivity, combined with the radical group's psychological manipulation and isolation tactics, led to the infamous transformation in her behavior, something the group likely hadn't anticipated when they took her. What began as a ploy to pressure authorities evolved into one of the most notorious and controversial cases of the 1970s, reflecting the volatile and uncertain nature of the era's political landscape. De Vries, also known by his adopted name, General Field Marshal Sink, continued to lead the radical group as they carried out a series of high-profile and controversial actions, cementing the group's place in American history as one of the most notorious urban guerrilla movements of the 1970s. When the state refused to release the imprisoned men, the radical group demanded that the Hearst family provide $70 worth of food to every needy person in California, a task that would have cost around $400 million. In response, Patricia Hearst's father secured a loan and quickly organized the donation of $2 million worth of food to the Bay Area's poor, creating a program called People in Need. However, the food distribution turned chaotic, and the radical group refused to release Patricia. During her captivity, Patty Hearst was initially confined to a small, dark closet for a full week. She was kept blindfolded, her vision completely obscured, and her hands were bound, limiting her ability to move. The space was cramped and uncomfortable, heightening her sense of fear and disorientation. The radical group used these conditions to exert psychological pressure on her, isolating her from the outside world and stripping away any sense of time or place. She was denied any semblance of normality, kept in near constant darkness, and subjected to an environment designed to break down her resistance and heighten her dependence on her captors. During this period, she was bombarded with the radical group's radical ideology, as members took turns lecturing her about their political beliefs and the reasons behind their violent actions. The goal was to indoctrinate her, using a combination of deprivation, manipulation, and fear. Hearst's captors played loud recordings and repeatedly exposed her to the group's revolutionary rhetoric, aiming to destabilize her emotionally and mentally. The physical constraints, tied hands and the tight, suffocating space, added to the sense of helplessness and contributed to what would become a turning point in her captivity. It was a brutal beginning to what would become a prolonged and deeply traumatic experience, setting the stage for the infamous transformation that followed. The closet became not only a physical prison but a psychological one, laying the groundwork for the profound changes that would take place in her behavior over the next several months. During her early captivity, the radical group founder Donald De Vries repeatedly threatened Patricia Hearst's life, warning her that any attempt to escape or resist would result in death. Although still blindfolded, she was occasionally allowed to leave the cramped closet to eat meals, always under strict supervision. Even during these brief moments outside the closet, her world remained dark and disorienting, as the blindfold stayed on. Gradually, Hearst was drawn into the group's environment, and the radical group began to involve her in their political discussions. Despite being held captive, she was encouraged, almost forced, to engage with the group's radical ideas. They provided her with a flashlight to read in the darkness of the closet, and she was given a collection of radical group political materials and manifestos to study and memorize. These writings were filled with the group's revolutionary rhetoric, which they hoped would reshape her thinking. Weeks turned into a blur of isolation and indoctrination, as Hearst remained confined to the closet for long stretches of time. This combination of deprivation, threats, and constant exposure to the group's ideology was a method of psychological pressure meant to destabilize her sense of self and bring her in line with the radical group's cause. De Vries continued to torture and manipulate Patty. He told her the group had been discussing your fate. He made it clear that her options were stark: either they would eliminate her, or she could join them and become one of their own, a member of the radical group. It wasn't just a threat, it was a blunt reality that he insisted she must face. He told her to start considering that staying with them might be her only way to survive. Patty felt the weight of his words pressing down on her. In that moment, she knew the danger was real, her life was hanging by a thread, entirely in their hands. With no way out and the constant pressure of their threats, she realized that resisting might only seal her fate. To survive, she had to adapt. Slowly, she began to align her thoughts with theirs, telling herself that agreeing with them might be the only way to stay alive. Day by day, she found herself changing. The threats never disappeared, but she adjusted, letting go of her previous identity piece by piece. She started to speak their language, echoing their ideas back to them, convincing herself that this might be the safest course. It wasn't about belief at first, it was about survival. But as she mirrored their thoughts and words, it became harder to distinguish what was genuine and what was self-preservation. Thank you for staying with me this far. Please subscribe, like, share and leave a comment so that YouTube can recommend this channel to other people. When Patricia Hearst was asked to make her choice, she decided to stay and fight alongside the radical group, Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA. It was at this point that they removed her blindfold, and for the first time, she was able to see the faces of her captors. This marked a significant shift in her captivity, from a state of constant disorientation to active participation. Patty weighed her options and decided to stay with the radical group, although she was told she could either be released and return to her previous life, or she could fully commit to joining their ranks. This choice was not just about physical freedom, it was a psychological turning point that weighed heavily on her. The offer came after weeks of isolation, threats, and relentless exposure to the group's radical ideology. By that time, Hearst had endured weeks of confinement in a dark closet, with limited contact outside of her captors. She was subjected to constant pressure, and her mental state had been worn down by the combination of fear, deprivation, and the need to survive. When the radical group made their offer, it was framed as a decision she needed to make for herself, either reject them and take the uncertain path of freedom, or accept their cause and become one of them. Choosing to join the radical group was not as straightforward as it seemed. Although the option of release was on the table, it was surrounded by unspoken threats and the risk of retaliation. The group's violent history and the reality of her captivity meant that she could not be sure that release actually meant safety. There was no guarantee that she would be unharmed or that they wouldn't track her down later. On the other hand, the radical group presented the idea of joining them as a chance to become part of something larger, to be on the right side of what they believed was a revolutionary struggle. In her recounting, Hearst explained that she chose to stay, claiming that the decision was influenced by the psychological and emotional strain she was under. She had been conditioned to feel that aligning herself with the radical group might be the safest path forward, even if it meant betraying her former identity. Joining them didn't just mean becoming a member, it involved taking up their cause, adopting their beliefs, and ultimately participating in their actions. It was a decision that would have far-reaching consequences, marking the beginning of her transformation from a kidnapped victim to an active participant in the group's notorious activities. Following her decision, Hearst's life with the radical group became more structured. She was given daily instruction, with a particular focus on learning her new responsibilities within the group. Much of her training centered around handling weapons, as she was taught how to use and maintain firearms in preparation for the group's militant activities. Angela Atwood, one of the key members, told Hearst that they wanted her to experience the freedom they believed existed within the unit, emphasizing that she was now part of their struggle. However, behind this facade of newfound inclusion, Hearst later revealed the darker side of her captivity. She claimed that during this period, she was assaulted and violated by William "Willie" Wolfe and Donald DeFries, two prominent figures within the group. These abuses were part of the coercion and manipulation she endured, adding another layer of trauma to her experience. The sense of freedom offered by the group was, in reality, an illusion, masked by threats, violence, and psychological pressure. On April 3, 1974, 2 months after her abduction, Patricia Hearst made a public announcement on an audio tape that was released to the media. In the tape, she declared that she had joined the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, and had adopted a new name, Tanya. The name was a tribute to Haiti Tamara Bunkbider, also known as Tanya, a close comrade of Che Guevara and a revolutionary figure in Latin America. This statement marked a dramatic shift in her identity and signaled her full alignment with the group's radical ideology, which she had been exposed to and, in many ways, coerced into adopting during her captivity. On April 15, 1974, Patricia Hearst was captured on surveillance footage during a bank robbery with the group at the Hibernia Bank branch in San Francisco's Sunset District, located at 1450 Noriega Street. In the video, Hearst was seen holding an M1 carbine, a semi-automatic rifle, as she participated in the armed robbery alongside other members of the group. Hearst was yelling commands at bank customers. The footage showed Hearst actively involved in the heist, not as a passive observer but as a participant, taking on the role of an armed lookout during the operation. This event shocked the nation, as it seemed to confirm that Hearst had become a willing member of the radical group, moving from victim to collaborator. The robbery resulted in the theft of over $10,000, and Hearst's presence at the scene raised questions about the nature of her involvement, whether she was acting out of genuine loyalty to the radical group's cause, under duress, or as a victim of psychological coercion. The incident became one of the most controversial moments of her captivity, casting doubt on the extent to which she had been brainwashed or had willingly aligned herself with the group's militant activities. During the Hibernia bank robbery, Patricia Hearst, using her radical group pseudonym, Tanya, shouted, "I'm Tanya." Up, up, up against the wall, while angrily cursing at the bank's customers and staff. In the chaos of the robbery, two unsuspecting men walked into the bank, unaware of what was happening, and were immediately shot and wounded by members of the group. Testimony from a witness during Hearst's later trial suggested that she had been trailing a few steps behind the other radical group members as they ran to the getaway car after the heist. This detail raised questions about her level of involvement, implying that while she was clearly present and armed, her position during the escape might have indicated hesitation or reluctance compared to the others. The robbery and its aftermath became a focal point in discussions of whether Hearst was acting voluntarily or under pressure from her captors. Attorney General William B. Saxby described Hearst as a common criminal and asserted that she was not a reluctant participant in the bank robbery. In contrast, James L. Browning Jr., another key figure in the case, expressed a more nuanced view, suggesting that Hearst's involvement might have been voluntary. This statement differed from an earlier comment he made, in which he acknowledged the possibility that she had been coerced into participating. Adding to the complexity, the FBI agent leading the investigation revealed that photographs taken during the robbery showed Symbionese Liberation Army (SLA) members pointing guns at Hearst, suggesting she could have been acting under duress. Nevertheless, a grand jury formally indicted Hearst for the robbery in June 1974. A month after the Hibernia bank robbery, on May 16, 1974, a dramatic confrontation unfolded at Mel's Sporting Goods in Inglewood, California. The incident began when the store manager noticed a man, later identified as William Heiress, attempting to steal a small item while browsing the store. Heiress had been shopping with his wife, Emily, while Patricia Hearst waited nearby in a van parked across the street, acting as a lookout. Suspicious of Heiress's behavior, the manager decided to keep an eye on him. When Heiress left the store without paying, the manager, accompanied by an employee, followed him outside and confronted him about the theft. A scuffle quickly broke out as the manager tried to detain Heiress, who resisted. In the struggle, a pistol unexpectedly fell out of Heiress's waistband, revealing that he was armed. This discovery escalated the tension, as the manager realized that the situation was far more dangerous than a simple shoplifting incident. Despite the weapon, the manager managed to restrain Heiress, but the situation was far from under control. Emily Heiress noticed the confrontation and alerted Hearst, who was still in the van. Hearing the commotion, Hearst grabbed a rifle and opened fire, sending bullets into the store's facade, attempting to force the manager and his employee to release Heiress. Patty discharged an entire magazine of an automatic carbine into the overhead facade, causing the manager to dive behind a light post. He tried to shoot back, but Hearst began aiming closer at the manager. This bold act allowed Heiress to break free and flee back to the van, where Hearst and the Heiress couple made their escape in a chaotic getaway. After fleeing the scene at Mel's Sporting Goods, Patricia Hearst and the Heiress couple, William and Emily Heiress, made a desperate escape that involved hijacking two vehicles and abducting their owners. In their haste to evade capture, the trio forced a young man out of his car, using it as their first getaway vehicle. The young man later recalled that, despite the fear and danger of the situation, he was struck by how friendly and personable Hearst was during the carjacking. Her unexpected politeness and calm demeanor left him hesitant to report the incident to the authorities. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic violence of the earlier robbery, making Hearst's behavior even more perplexing to those trying to understand her true role within the Symbionese Liberation Army. Not long after, they abandoned the first stolen car and hijacked a second vehicle, forcing the driver out at gunpoint. This second carjacking was more urgent, as they knew police would soon be closing in. The group was determined to stay ahead of the manhunt, which was now intensifying due to their increasingly reckless actions. The incident at Mel's Sporting Goods led to a rapid escalation in law enforcement's pursuit of Hearst and the radical group. It highlighted Hearst's active role in the group's criminal activities, intensifying the nationwide manhunt and increasing speculation about whether she was truly a victim or a willing participant in the group's violent agenda. By the time the victims were able to report their abductions, Hearst and the Heiress couple had disappeared into the dense urban landscape of Los Angeles, temporarily eluding law enforcement. These back-to-back carjackings only deepened the mystery surrounding Hearst, as her behavior seemed to fluctuate between coerced compliance and voluntary involvement in the group's criminal spree, making her one of the most elusive and controversial figures of the 1970s. Patricia Hearst and the Heiress couple hijacked 2 cars and kidnapped their owners. One of the victims, a young man, found Hearst so charming that he hesitated to report the incident. During the trial, he testified about his interaction with Hearst, recalling how she discussed the effectiveness of cyanide-tipped bullets and repeatedly asked him if he was okay. Despite the unsettling nature of the conversation, the victim's description highlighted Hearst's calm and personable demeanor during the abduction. By the time Patricia Hearst and the Heiress couple returned to Los Angeles, police had already surrounded the primary base of the group. With their safe house compromised, Patty, Williams and Emily was forced to hide out in a different location to avoid capture. 6 members of the group were still in the hideout when the police swooped on it. There was a 60 minutes gunfight with the police. 2 members were fatally shot. A fire broke out in the house. DeFries committed suicide by shooting himself while the others lost their lives in the fire. When the fire broke out during the police siege of the group's hideout in Los Angeles on May 17, 1974, Patty Hearst and the couple, William and Emily Heiress, were not inside the targeted house. They had managed to evade the authorities by hiding at a separate location. As a result, they were not present when the shootout erupted, leading to a devastating fire that eliminated the 6 members who had been inside the hideout. Hearst and the Heiress remained on the run, continuing their activities and evading capture for several more months. Warrants were issued for the arrest of Hearst and the Heiress for several felonies, including 2 counts of kidnapping. Emily Heiress attended a rally in Berkeley to honor the memory of Angela Atwood, Joseph Soltysik, Donald DeFries, and other founding members of the Symbionese Liberation Army who had died during the police siege in Los Angeles. Heiress recognized Atwood's acquaintance Kathy Solia among the radicals whom she had known from civil rights groups. Solia introduced the 3 fugitives to Jack Scott, an athletics reformer and radical, and he agreed to provide them help and money. Hearst's involvement in later crimes continued to amaze people. Hearst helped make improvised explosive devices. These were used in 2 unsuccessful attempts to kill police officers during August 1975, one of the devices failed to detonate. When Patricia Hearst was arrested, investigators discovered marked bills in her apartment, directly connecting her to the armed robbery of the Crocker National Bank in Carmichael, California. The presence of these marked bills provided crucial evidence that she had been involved in the heist. It was later revealed that during this bank robbery, Hearst had played a significant role as the getaway car driver, helping the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, execute their plan. The robbery at the Crocker National Bank was a particularly violent one. In the midst of the heist, bank customer Myrna Upsall, a 42-year-old mother of 4, was killed. She had been at the bank simply to deposit funds for her church when the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, stormed in, guns drawn. Amid the chaos, Emily Heiress, one of the key SLA members involved in the heist, was masked and armed. In a tense and frenzied moment, Heiress pulled the trigger, fatally shooting Upsall. Upsall's death sent shockwaves through the community and across the nation, adding a tragic human face to the violent campaign waged by the SLA. Her murder highlighted the deadly seriousness of the SLA's activities and shifted public perception, casting them not just as a group of radical militants but as dangerous criminals willing to kill innocent people. The incident also intensified law enforcement's determination to capture all involved and bring them to justice. On September 18, 1975, Patricia Hearst was arrested in a San Francisco apartment alongside Wendy Yoshimura, another member of the group. The arrest was carried out by a joint team led by San Francisco Police Inspector Timothy F. Casey and his partner, Police Officer Lawrence R. Passero, along with FBI Special Agent Thomas J. Patton and a group of FBI agents, Jason Moulton, Frank Doyle Jr., Larry Lawler, Monty Hall, Dick Vitamonte, Leo Breniason, and Ray Campos. The marked money found in Hearst's possession became a key piece of evidence in the authorities' case against her, suggesting not only her involvement but also her complicity in the violent activities of the group. This discovery further complicated her defense, casting doubt on claims that she had been acting solely under coercion and deepening the controversy around her true level of participation with the group. Years later, in 2002, Emily Heiress, by then using her married name, Emily Montague, publicly admitted her role in Upsall's death, expressing regret for the killing during her court proceedings. Her confession and conviction brought some closure to Upsall's family, who had waited decades for justice, but it also revived the debate over Patricia Hearst's role, as she was present during the robbery as the getaway driver, raising questions about her complicity in the group's deadly actions. Hearst was potentially at risk for felony murder charges and could testify as a witness against Heiress for a capital offense. When Hearst was booked into jail, she identified her occupation as an urban guerrilla, indicating her continued alignment with the radical ideology of the SLA. Despite her arrest, she seemed resolute and defiant, asking her attorney to pass on a message: "Tell everybody that I'm smiling, that I feel free and strong, and I send my greetings and love to all the sisters and brothers out there." Her words suggested a sense of empowerment and solidarity with the SLA, even in custody, underscoring the complex narrative of her involvement with the group. At the time of her arrest, Patricia Hearst's weight had plummeted to just 87 pounds, 40 kilograms. Psychologist Margaret Singer, who assessed Hearst in October 1975, described her as a low IQ, low-effect zombie, reflecting the physical and psychological toll her time with the group had taken on her. Singer's assessment suggested that Hearst was deeply affected by the intense brainwashing and trauma she had endured during her captivity. At the time of her arrest, Patricia Hearst's IQ had dropped to 112, down from a previous measurement of 130. She experienced significant gaps in her memory regarding her life before adopting the alias Tanya, and she struggled with heavy smoking and frequent nightmares. Despite these challenges, she was found to have no mental illness or defect that would absolve her of responsibility for her actions. Legally, a person is only considered not responsible for criminal actions if they were under duress, meaning they faced a clear and present threat of death or serious harm. For Hearst to be acquitted based on the claim that she had been brainwashed would have been a groundbreaking and entirely unprecedented legal argument. The court appointed psychiatrist Louis Jolyon West, a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, a brainwashing expert who offered his services without charge. Following the trial, Drive West wrote a newspaper article in which he appealed to President Jimmy Carter, urging him to grant Patricia Hearst clemency and release her from prison. In her memoir, Every Secret Thing, 1982, Patricia Hearst recounted a significant meeting she had with Robert J. Lifton, a renowned psychiatrist and expert on coercive persuasion and thought reform from Yale University. She described spending 15 hours with Lifton, during which she thoroughly discussed her time with the group. Lifton, who had written extensively on the psychological effects of brainwashing, concluded that Hearst was a classic case of someone who had been subjected to extreme coercion. According to Lifton, her experiences met all the psychological criteria for a coerced prisoner of war, someone who is manipulated and controlled through force, fear, and mind-altering techniques. Lifton explained that her responses to the situation were entirely consistent with the trauma and brainwashing she had endured. He added that had Hearst reacted in any other way, it would have been seen as suspicious, further validating her claims of psychological manipulation and the profound impact it had on her. After spending several weeks in custody, Patricia Hearst distanced herself from the Symbionese Liberation Army and publicly rejected her previous allegiance to the group. Initially, her lawyer, Terence Hallinan, advised her to remain silent and avoid speaking to anyone, including psychiatrists. Hallinan proposed a defense based on involuntary intoxication, arguing that the SLA had drugged her, which affected her judgment and memory, making her actions under their control. However, Hallinan was replaced by a new attorney, F. Lee Bailey, who shifted the defense strategy. Bailey argued that Hearst had been under coercion or duress during the crimes, meaning that her intent at the time was influenced by the extreme pressures and threats she faced. This defense closely resembled the brainwashing argument, which Hallinan had cautioned was not legally viable. Hearst eventually underwent lengthy interviews with various psychiatrists, who assessed the psychological impact of her captivity and her involvement with the group. Patricia Hearst was the sole defendant arraigned for the Hibernia bank robbery, and her trial began on January 15, 1976. The proceedings were marked by several significant legal decisions made by Judge Oliver Jesse Carter. One of his key rulings was that Hearst's taped and written statements made after the bank robbery, while she was still a fugitive with the group, were admissible, as he determined they were voluntary. Despite challenges, the judge allowed the prosecution to present these statements as evidence of her involvement in the robbery, even though Hearst's defense argued that the tapes and writings were not entirely her own. They suggested that stylistic analysis showed the statements were influenced or even partly written by others in the SLA. However, Judge Carter disallowed expert testimony supporting this claim. The trial took an unusual turn when the judge allowed the prosecution to introduce statements and actions that Hearst made long after the robbery as evidence of her mental state at the time. These included a jailhouse recording of a conversation between Hearst and a friend, where Hearst spoke about her radical beliefs and used profanities, including references to feminism and her political views. Interestingly, Judge Carter allowed these recordings to be presented, but he excluded tapes from psychiatrist Louis Jolyon West, who had interviewed Hearst in jail and had concluded that she had been brainwashed by the SLA. West's expert testimony was excluded, which the defense saw as critical to supporting their argument that Hearst had been coerced. Judge Carter's impartiality came under scrutiny as he was reportedly seen resting his eyes during the testimony of witnesses who were favorable to the defense, including Drive West and other mental health experts. The defense argued that this indicated a lack of attention to key testimony that could have supported their case and shown Hearst's actions were the result of extreme duress and psychological manipulation. These decisions made the trial controversial, with critics questioning whether Hearst received a fair trial under the circumstances. The phrase, resting his eyes, is a euphemism often used to suggest that someone is closing their eyes or appearing to doze off or not paying attention during a situation, especially during something important like a meeting or trial. In the context of the trial, it was implied that Judge Carter might have been ignoring or not fully focusing on the testimony that was favorable to the defense. Essentially, it suggests that the judge wasn't giving the defense's arguments the attention they deserved, possibly leading to the perception of bias or lack of impartiality. In her testimony, Hearst stated that her captors had threatened her, insisting that she show enthusiasm during the robbery and warning that any mistake could cost her life. Her defense attorney, F. Lee Bailey, presented photographs as evidence, which depicted SLA members, including Camilla Hall, aiming guns at Hearst during the heist. Regarding the incident at Mel's sporting goods store, where she chose not to escape, Hearst explained that she had been coached throughout her captivity on how to respond in emergencies. She mentioned that one of the training sessions closely mirrored the situation she faced when the store manager detained the Heiress. Reflecting on her actions during that moment, Hearst said, "When it happened, I didn't even think. I just did it, and if I had not done it and if they had been able to get away, they would have killed me." During the trial, Dr. Harry Kozel, testifying for the prosecution, characterized Hearst as a rebel in search of a cause and asserted that her involvement in the Hibernia bank robbery was an act of free will. His testimony suggested that Hearst's participation was not the result of coercion but a deliberate choice. This argument was supported by another prosecution witness, Dr. Joel Fort, a psychiatrist who was asked by prosecutor James L. Browning Jr. whether Hearst had been in fear of death or serious bodily harm during the robbery. Dr. Fort responded, no, indicating that he did not believe Hearst's actions were motivated by fear. This assertion prompted a strong objection from Hearst's defense attorney, F. Lee Bailey, who was visibly angered by the suggestion. Dr. Fort went further in his assessment, describing Hearst as moral and alleging that she had willingly engaged in sexual relationships with SLA members, including Willie Wolfe and Donald DeFreeze. Hearst, however, firmly denied these claims both in court and publicly, maintaining that any sexual contact was not consensual. Prosecutor Browning attempted to undermine Hearst's credibility by highlighting discrepancies between her testimony and her written accounts during captivity. He pointed to writings that seemed to depict Hearst's interactions with Wolfe in a different light than she presented in court. Hearst countered by explaining that these writings were coerced narratives, reflecting the SLA's version of events rather than her true feelings. She also recounted that, when she initially refused to write a more favorable account about what she saw as sexual abuse by Wolfe, William Heiress had struck her in the face. The prosecution's strategy included delving into Hearst's past in an effort to question her credibility. Judge Oliver Carter permitted testimony from prosecution psychiatrists about Hearst's earlier sexual history, despite the fact that these events had taken place long before her kidnapping and involvement with the SLA. This decision was controversial, as it raised questions about the relevance of her past to the specific charges she faced. Ultimately, the prosecution aimed to paint a picture of Hearst as a willing participant in the SLA's activities, in direct contradiction to the defense's portrayal of her as a brainwashed and traumatized victim. During the trial, Patricia Hearst's courtroom demeanor drew criticism, as she often appeared lethargic and detached. An Associated Press report attributed her condition to medication prescribed by jail doctors, suggesting that the drugs might have dulled her responses and impacted her presentation to the jury. The defense's strategy, led by attorney F. Lee Bailey, came under intense scrutiny, particularly for his decision to have Hearst testify in her own defense. Hearst's testimony was marked by her repeated refusals to answer certain questions, a tactic that some observers viewed as damaging to her credibility. Legal expert Alan Dershowitz later criticized Bailey's handling of the situation, suggesting that Bailey had been caught off guard by an unexpected shift from Judge Oliver Carter. Initially, Judge Carter seemed to indicate that Hearst would be allowed to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights, protecting her from self-incrimination for events that occurred after the Hibernia bank robbery, the crime for which she was on trial. This would mean that either the jury would not be present for portions of her testimony related to those events, or they would be explicitly instructed not to make any inferences from her refusal to answer. However, in a surprise move, Judge Carter changed his stance, ruling that Hearst could not use the Fifth Amendment to avoid answering questions about her actions beyond the robbery. This shift placed Bailey in a difficult position, as his defense strategy had relied on the assumption that certain sensitive topics would remain shielded from the jury's scrutiny. Consequently, Hearst's refusal to answer those questions in front of the jury painted her as evasive, further weakening the defense's case. Critics argued that this courtroom miscalculation, combined with Hearst's drug-affected demeanor, had a significant impact on the jury's perception of her credibility and the outcome of the trial. A few months after her capture, Patricia Hearst began cooperating with the authorities, providing detailed information about the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, and its activities. Crucially, this information was not given under oath, meaning it could not be used against her in court. In February 1976, just before her trial, an explosion at Hearst Castle, a symbolic target tied to her wealthy family, added another layer of drama to an already high-profile case. In her testimony, Hearst revealed that she had been sexually assaulted by SLA member Willie Wolfe, describing the relationship as abusive and coercive. In response, Emily Heiress, another SLA member who was in jail at the time, gave an interview to a magazine, suggesting that Hearst's actions contradicted her claims of abuse. Heiress pointed to a small stone carving that Wolfe had given to Hearst, which she had kept throughout her time with the SLA. According to Heiress, Hearst's decision to hold on to the trinket indicated that she had a romantic attachment to Wolfe, challenging Hearst's narrative of coercion. Hearst countered Heiress's interpretation by explaining that she had retained the stone carving not out of affection, but because she believed it to be an important archaeological artifact, a pre-Columbian piece of significant historical value. However, prosecutor James L. Browning Jr. seized on Heiress's interpretation, using it as a way to question Hearst's credibility. During the trial, Browning dramatically displayed the stone carving to the jury, suggesting it was a symbol of a voluntary and intimate connection between Hearst and Wolfe. This tactic had a noticeable impact. Some jurors later reported that the stone carving, which Browning brandished repeatedly, was a pivotal piece of evidence in their deliberations. They viewed it as a sign that Hearst was not entirely truthful about her relationship with Wolfe, casting doubt on her claims that she had been a victim of manipulation and coercion. The prosecutor's use of the carving ultimately became a powerful symbol in the trial, reinforcing the image of Hearst as a willing participant in the SLA's activities rather than a kidnapped victim acting out of fear for her life. In his closing argument, prosecutor James L. Browning Jr. sought to dismantle the defense's portrayal of Patricia Hearst as a coerced victim. He argued that her involvement in the Hibernia bank robbery was voluntary and not the result of threats or intimidation. To support this claim, Browning pointed to the ideological stance of the female SLA members, emphasizing that they were feminists who, he suggested, would not have permitted Hearst to be sexually assaulted. This argument was intended to cast doubt on Hearst's narrative of coercion and victimization, framing her instead as a willing and ideologically aligned participant in the group's criminal activities. Years later, in her autobiography, Hearst expressed deep dissatisfaction with her defense attorney, F. Lee Bailey, particularly during the crucial final phase of her trial. She described Bailey as unfocused and lacking the vigor expected of a top defense lawyer in a high-stakes case. According to Hearst, Bailey's appearance during the closing arguments was disheveled, as if he were suffering from a hangover. She recalled a moment when he fumbled clumsily, spilling water down the front of his pants, a gesture that seemed to embody the disarray of his final arguments. Hearst depicted his closing statement as disjointed, lacking the clear and decisive points needed to sway the jury in her favor. In his final remarks to the court, Bailey's defense appeared to rely heavily on an emotional appeal rather than a strict legal argument. He stated, "But simple application of the rules, I think, will yield one decent result, and that is, there is not anything close to proof beyond a reasonable doubt that Patty Hearst wanted to be a bank robber. What you know, and you know in your hearts to be true, is beyond dispute. There was talk about her dying, and she wanted to survive." His words highlighted Hearst's desperation during her time with the SLA, arguing that survival, not a desire to commit crimes, motivated her actions. However, this approach was seen by some as lacking in rigor, failing to counter the prosecution's narrative that she had willingly embraced the group's radical agenda. Bailey's perceived lack of focus in those final moments of the trial left Hearst feeling abandoned by the person she had trusted to defend her against life-altering charges. The jury ultimately found her guilty, a verdict that many believed could have been influenced by what Hearst described as Bailey's ineffective and lackluster closing argument. Browning, meanwhile, would go on to become a judge, his courtroom success in the Hearst trial solidifying his reputation in the legal field. On March 20, 1976, Patricia Hearst was found guilty of bank robbery and using a firearm during the commission of a felony. The jury's decision led to the imposition of the maximum sentence, 35 years in prison, although the final sentencing was left open, with Judge Oliver Carter withholding a specific determination. However, Judge Carter passed away before a final sentence could be confirmed, and the task of deciding Hearst's fate fell to Judge William H. Orrick Jr. In his ruling, Judge Orrick reduced Hearst's sentence to 7 years imprisonment. He delivered a stern rebuke during sentencing, noting that rebellious young people who, for whatever reason, become revolutionaries, and voluntarily commit criminal acts will be punished. His statement underscored the court's view that Hearst's actions, despite her claims of coercion, were criminal and required accountability. Nevertheless, Oreck's decision to lower the original sentence reflected a recognition that the case was complex, shaped by extraordinary circumstances involving Hearst's time with the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA. Following her conviction, Hearst was incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California. Her time in prison was marked by a series of health crises, beginning with a collapsed lung, which led to emergency surgery. This medical emergency forced her to miss a scheduled court appearance where she was to testify against Bill and Emily Heiress, fellow SLA members. The Heiress's were facing multiple charges, including robbery, kidnapping, and assault, but Hearst's inability to testify delayed the proceedings. For her own safety, Hearst was held in solitary confinement during her imprisonment, as authorities feared that her high-profile case might make her a target. Despite the isolation, concerns over her security extended beyond the prison walls. When she was granted bail in November 1976, pending an appeal, it came with strict conditions. The court required that she remain under close protection while out on bond, a precaution her family took seriously. Her father, Randolph Hearst, went to great lengths to ensure her safety, hiring dozens of bodyguards to shield her from potential threats. The appeal period represented a momentary reprieve from the bleakness of prison life, but Hearst's legal battles were far from over. In addition to the federal charges she had already been convicted of, she still faced pending charges related to her involvement in a shootout at Mel's sporting goods store and other crimes allegedly committed while she was with the SLA. Each step in the legal process kept her story in the public eye, a saga that captivated and polarized the nation as debates continued over whether she was a victim, a willing participant, or something in between. In the case involving the shootout at Mel's sporting goods store, Patricia Hearst faced additional legal challenges. She ultimately pleaded no contest to the charges, avoiding a lengthy trial. In response, Superior Court Judge Talbot Callister opted to show leniency, granting her probation instead of a prison sentence. Judge Callister expressed his belief that Hearst had been subjected to a level of coercion that amounted to psychological torture, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances of her time with the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA. California Attorney General L.J. Younger weighed in on the case, addressing public concerns about whether Hearst had received special treatment due to her family's wealth and influence. He argued that, contrary to the perception of a lenient double standard for the rich, Hearst had actually received a harsher sentence than someone of lesser means might have faced under similar circumstances. While he maintained that there was no legal basis for a brainwashing defense, Younger acknowledged that Hearst's criminal actions were rooted in her initial kidnapping, a factor that complicated her culpability. Despite these mitigating arguments, Hearst's legal battles were far from over. In May 1978, her bail was revoked after her appeals were unsuccessful, with the Supreme Court refusing to hear her case. This decision meant that she had to return to prison to continue serving her sentence. Initially, the prison authorities did not take any special precautions to ensure her safety, despite the high-profile nature of her case. However, this changed abruptly when Hearst discovered a dead rat left on her bunk, an ominous message coinciding with the arraignment of William and Emily Heiress, two key figures in the SLA, on charges related to her abduction. The Heiress's were eventually convicted, but only on a lesser charge of simple kidnapping. The prosecution failed to secure more serious convictions for kidnapping for ransom or kidnapping with bodily injury, charges that would have carried much longer sentences. As a result, both William and Emily Heiress served relatively short prison terms, completing their sentences after 8 years each. This outcome was seen by some as a reflection of the complexity and ambiguity surrounding Hearst's involvement with the SLA, where questions of coercion, personal responsibility, and the impact of her captivity on her actions were hotly debated. Hearst's legal and personal saga had become a national spectacle, stirring public discourse about crime, privilege, and the limits of victimhood. Her story raised broader questions about the justice system, societal expectations, and the challenges of understanding coercion in cases involving intense psychological pressure. In the years following Patricia Hearst's conviction, a surprising coalition of supporters emerged, advocating for her release and reassessment of her case. Among them was Representative Leo Ryan, who had begun collecting signatures on a petition urging Hearst's release. Tragically, Ryan's efforts were cut short when he was murdered in 1978 while on a humanitarian mission to the Jonestown settlement in Guyana, an event that drew worldwide attention to the dangers of cult manipulation and coercion. Actor John Wayne, known for his conservative views, added a poignant commentary in the wake of the Jonestown tragedy, where over 900 followers of cult leader Jim Jones died in a mass suicide. Wayne argued that if the public could accept that Jim Jones had effectively brainwashed hundreds of adults into ending their lives, it should not be so difficult to believe that the Symbionese Liberation Army, SLA, could have brainwashed a kidnapped teenage girl into participating in their crimes. His remarks highlighted a growing sentiment that Hearst's actions were not entirely voluntary, given the extreme circumstances of her abduction and captivity. Support for Hearst's case gained momentum, and in a significant development, President Jimmy Carter decided to intervene. On February 1, 1979, Carter commuted Hearst's federal prison sentence, reducing it to the 22 months she had already served. This commutation occurred 8 months before she was even eligible for her first parole hearing, reflecting the belief among some that her sentence had been overly harsh in light of her claims of coercion. However, Hearst's release came with stringent conditions. She remained on probation for the state charges related to the shootout at Mel's Sporting Goods, reminder that her legal troubles had not fully concluded despite the federal commutation. Years later, Hearst's story took another dramatic turn when President Bill Clinton granted her a full pardon on January 20, 2001, his final day in office. This act of clemency restored Hearst's full civil rights, including the right to vote and own property, and erased the remaining legal consequences of her criminal record. The pardon was a deeply symbolic gesture, capping off decades of debate over whether Patricia Hearst had been a victim of Stockholm Syndrome, a willing participant, or something in between. Her release and eventual pardon did not erase the scars left by her years of captivity and the ensuing legal battles, but they did allow her to move on from a chapter of her life that had captivated and divided the American public. Hearst's saga remains a complex case study in the interplay between crime, coercion, privilege, and the justice system, with lingering questions about the nature of responsibility and victimization in the face of psychological manipulation. 2 months after her release from prison, Patricia Hearst married Bernard Lee Shaw, 1945 to 2013, a former policeman who had been part of the security detail assigned to protect her during her time on bail. Bernie was working on the security detail with her family, and that's when they first crossed paths. For a while, he was just following Hearts around on her dates, making sure she was safe. But then, things started to change. He wasn't just part of the security team anymore. Before she knew it, he was the date. Hearts and Bernard married in 1979. Their union marked the beginning of a new chapter in Hearst's life, as the couple went on to have 2 children, Gillian and Lydia Hearst-Shaw. In the years following her release, Hearst became increasingly involved in charitable work, channeling her energies into causes she felt passionate about. She became particularly active in a foundation dedicated to helping children affected by AIDS, using her platform to raise awareness and funds for the cause. Hearst's philanthropic efforts extended beyond AIDS-related charities. She participated in various fundraising activities and worked with other organizations focused on helping vulnerable populations. This new direction in her life allowed her to distance herself from the traumatic events of her past while contributing positively to society. 5 decades after Patricia Hearst kidnapped, one of her kidnappers granted an interview where he exposed another angle to Hearst's story. He said, at the time of her kidnap, Hearst had already distanced herself from her mother, whom she saw as a gold digger, and was uncertain about marrying her fiancé, Steve Weed. Weed seemed more interested in her family's wealth than in her. While with the SLA, Hearst's conversations with feminist members made her realize she couldn't return to Weed. She eventually fell in love with another SLA member, Willie Wolfe. Heiress also believed that Patty stayed with the SLA partly because her father, Randy Hearst, refused to pay the ransom, which upset Patty and made her feel further disconnected from her family. When Patty heard on the radio that her father wouldn't meet the ransom demands, she was deeply disappointed. The SLA trained her to use a shotgun for self-defense in case of an FBI confrontation. However, Heiress tried to convince her to leave the group, warning her that staying would put her life in danger. Patty faced a tough choice. She didn't want to return to the apartment she had shared with Weed, where media attention and FBI agents were making everything chaotic. On March 31, the SLA let her decide whether to stay or leave. After choosing to stay, they revealed their faces to her for the first time. Despite her wealthy background, Patty played an important role in spreading the SLA's message. She recorded statements that were published in her father's San Francisco Examiner and broadcast widely, supporting the group's cause of fighting for marginalized people. She also criticized her father's financial excuses and her mother's ties to political figures like Ronald Reagan. On April 15, 1974, Patty participated in a bank robbery at Hibernia Bank, marking her shift from a victim to a criminal. The group then moved to Los Angeles, where they went shopping for supplies. During this trip, Heiress was caught by security at a store for suspected shoplifting. Patty could have driven away, but instead, she fired her gun to help him escape, putting herself in danger. The next day, on May 17, 1974, 6 SLA members, including Willie Wolfe, died in a shootout with police. Patty and the Heiress watched the coverage from hiding. By then, Patty knew turning herself in was dangerous, so they traveled separately across the country to keep her safe. For the next 16 months, they didn't even know where she was living. Meanwhile, the Heiress were convicted for kidnapping and carjacking, but they were never charged for the bank robbery. Patty, the only SLA member seen inside the bank, had been part of the robbery but was not charged in the shooting death of Myrna Upsall, a mother of 4. After the Upsall family threatened to sue, they settled out of court for $300,000, with Randy Hearst writing one of the settlement checks. Patricia Hearst published her memoir Every Secret Thing in 1981, co-written with Alvin Moscow, which led to authorities considering new charges against her. In a 2009 NBC interview, she denied suggestions that she had been in a consensual relationship with SLA member William Wolfe, calling it an outrageous insult to rape victims. In her later years, Hearst became involved in media projects, producing a travel channel special Secrets of San Simeon, which gave viewers an inside look at Hearst Castle. She also co-wrote the novel Murder at San Simeon with Cordelia Frances Biddle, based on the death of Thomas H. Ince. Hearst appeared in several films directed by John Waters, including Cry Baby, 1990, Serial Mom, 1994, and Pecker, 1998, among others. She also made cameo appearances in films like Biodome, 1996, and Second Best, 2004, and produced Pottersville. Her television roles included appearances in The Adventures of Pete and Pete, Boston Common, Son of the Beach, and Tripping the Rift, as well as guest spots on Frasier and Veronica Mars. In addition to her acting, Hearst participated in dog shows, with her Shih Tzu Rocket winning the Toy Group at the Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show in 2015. In 2017, her French Bulldog Tuggy won Best of Breed, and Ruby took Best of Opposite Sex at the same show. We have come to the end of this story. Thank you for staying with me this far. I need your help, please. If you enjoyed my hard work, then like and share this video, so YouTube can recommend it to other users. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, then do it quickly. Click on the notification bell icon. See you again in the next video with another true story. Thank you for supporting me with a subscription.